My name is Ilara Vance, and I am 22 years old, though in the eyes of my parents, I have never been more than a biological error that required expensive camouflage. For 20 years, I was the invisible daughter, the girl who was told she was too slow to understand the family business and too plain to marry into another one, while my older brother, Julian, was groomed to inherit an empire he didn't have the intellect to sustain. My father, Marcus Vance, is a man who measures human worth by the weight of a platinum credit card and the prestige of a zip code, specifically our 5-acre estate in Westport, Connecticut, where the grass is cut to a precise 2-inch height every Tuesday by a crew that costs more than most people's annual mortgage. He truly believed that by burning my college application, he was merely pruning a dead branch from the family tree to let the golden fruit of his son's future flourish. But I am getting ahead of myself, as the smell of charred, heavy-stock paper and expensive ink is something that never quite leaves your nostrils once it has signaled the end of your life as a submissive daughter. The scene played out in the great room, a space designed more for architectural photography than for actual living, featuring white Italian leather sofas that cost $30,000 apiece and a floor-to-ceiling fireplace carved from a single slab of Calicut marble. It was a cold Tuesday in late October, the kind of New England evening where the wind rattles the floor-to-ceiling triple-paned windows, and the humidity in the room was kept at a perfect 45% by a centralized climate control system that I had secretly hacked 3 months prior. My father stood there, his tailored charcoal suit from Savile Row perfectly draped over his broad shoulders, holding my hard-earned application to the University of Connecticut School of Engineering. I had worked 3 secret shifts a week at a bookstore in Norwalk to save that $85 application fee, hiding the crumpled $20 bills in an old, hollowed-out copy of Advanced Engineering Mathematics. He didn't scream or shout because Marcus Vance considered volume to be a tool for the lower classes. Instead, he simply looked at the envelope with a sneer of profound disappointment, his thumb flicking the edge of the paper. "She's too stupid for college," he said, his voice as smooth and cold as the chilled rosé my mother was currently sipping. "Honestly, I'm doing the admissions board a favor by burning this trash." With a flick of his wrist that was almost casual, he tossed the envelope into the gas-fed flames. I watched the white paper curl, the blue ink of my signature blackening and then vanishing into a glowing orange ember. My mother, Catherine, didn't even offer a sympathetic glance. She was preoccupied with the lighting of the room, adjusting her 18-karat gold Bulgari Serpenti watch on her wrist, her manicured fingers, a shade of blush pink that cost $200 at the salon in Greenwich, tapping rhythmically against her crystal glass. She took a slow sip of her $14-a-glass Whispering Angel and told me, without looking up, that I should probably start looking for waitress shifts at the local diner in town because they weren't going to subsidize my idle lifestyle anymore. They thought they were watching my future turn into gray ash in that fireplace, a symbolic execution of my ambitions to ensure I stayed home and served as a quiet, compliant assistant to Julian's inevitable rise. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom because they had spent 2 decades convinced I was cognitively inferior, was that I had a 1,600 SAT score hidden under a loose mahogany floorboard in my 120-square-foot bedroom at the end of the servants' hallway. While they were busy paying $400 an hour for a private tutor to drag Julian through his remedial pre-calculus homework, I was staying up until 3 in the morning on a refurbished Lenovo ThinkPad I'd bought for $90 at a pawn shop, teaching myself Python and C++. The contrast between the life they projected and the reality I lived was a chasm of deliberate cruelty. Julian had a 2024 sapphire blue Porsche 911 Carrera parked in the heated 4-car garage, a graduation gift for simply managed to pass his high school exams with a C- average. I, on the other hand, was expected to take the Coastal Link bus if I needed to go anywhere, or better yet, stay within the confines of the estate to help the housekeeper, Maria, polish the silver service for the upcoming autumn gala. My room was the smallest in the house, a former nursery that still smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, tucked away far from the master suite. It was my fortress, my laboratory, and my secret. Beneath those floorboards lay my true identity: the test scores, the acceptance letters I had intercepted from the mail, and the login credentials for a high-frequency trading algorithm I had built from scratch. While my father stood by the fire, feeling the warmth of his perceived power, my old laptop was humming quietly upstairs, hidden under a pile of oversized sweaters. It was currently running a neural network optimization script that I had spent 6 months perfecting. A piece of software designed to analyze market fluctuations in the tech sector with a 98% accuracy rate. I had named the project EOS after the goddess of the dawn because it represented the beginning of their end and the start of my light. My father's wealth was built on real estate and traditional manufacturing, industries he understood with the blunt force of a hammer. He had no idea that the daughter he called stupid was currently siphoning data from his own company's server to prove that his chief operating officer was embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars through a series of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Every time my mother sighed about my lack of social grace or my father commented on my quietness as a sign of a dull mind, I would simply focus on the micro-actions of my day. I would feel the weight of the silver polish cloth in my hand as I rubbed the family's 1920s Tiffany & Company tea set, the sharp scent of the chemical cleaner stinging my nostrils, while in my head, I was calculating the derivative of a complex function or visualizing the architecture of a new database. I had learned to move through the house like a ghost, a high-functioning shadow that they had trained themselves to ignore. I knew exactly how the floorboards creaked in the hallway, how the security cameras had a 4-second blind spot during their rotation, and how the ice in my father's nightly scotch clinked against the glass. 2 cubes, exactly, of artisanal clear ice that he insisted be hand-carved. The injustice of it all wasn't just in the burnt application, it was in the years of gaslighting. It was the time I was 10 and I solved a Rubik's Cube in under a minute, only for my mother to tell me it was a fluke and that I should focus on my needlepoint because girls like me needed to be useful with their hands. It was the time Julian crashed his first car, a black Audi A4, into a stone wall while driving under the influence, and my father paid $50,000 to make the police report disappear, while I was grounded for a month because I had forgotten to turn off the lights in the pantry. They had created a narrative where I was a burden, a financial drain, and a disappointment, all to justify their obsession with Julian, the handsome, athletic, and utterly vacuous heir to the Vance name. But I am getting ahead of myself. That night, after the fire had died down to white dust and the smell of the rosé had been replaced by the heavy scent of my father's expensive Cuban cigar, I went upstairs to my small room. I locked the door, moved the heavy oak dresser that I had reinforced with metal brackets, and pulled up the floorboard. I reached in and felt the cool, crisp paper of my actual SAT results, the embossed seal of the College Board mocking the ashes downstairs. I opened my laptop, the screen's blue light reflecting in my eyes, and watched the progress bar on EOS. It was at 99%. The optimization was complete. The script was now ready to be deployed, a digital virus of truth that would strip the gold leaf off my brother's reputation and expose the rot at the heart of my father's business. I sat there on the floor, the cold draft from the window seeping through my thin cotton pajamas, and I realized that family isn't blood. Family isn't the people who share your DNA while treating you like a nuisance to be managed. Family is a concept I hadn't yet found, but I knew what it wasn't. It wasn't the man who burned his daughter's dreams for sport, and it wasn't the woman who watched it happen with a glass of wine in her hand. My father thought he had won a small battle in his quest for control, but he had actually provided the final spark for my departure. As the clock on my nightstand ticked toward midnight, the sound echoing in the silent, opulent house, I began to pack a small bag with the essentials: my documents, my laptop, and the $3,000 I had hidden in a hollowed-out textbook. I wasn't just leaving, I was deconstructing their reality. The girl they called stupid was about to become the most expensive mistake they ever made, and as I looked at the 1,600 on my score sheet, I knew that the fire in the great room was nothing compared to the one I was about to ignite in their perfect, polished lives. The weight of the silence in the Vance estate always felt like a physical pressure, a heavy velvet curtain that muffled the truth and amplified the lies. But that night, the silence felt different. It felt like the breath taken before a scream. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the distant kitchen, a high-end Sub-Zero model that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and the occasional click of the heating system. Every sound was a reminder of the luxury that was meant to stifle me. I looked at the Bulgari watch box on my mother's vanity earlier that day. The receipt left out carelessly showed a price tag of $12,400. That single accessory could have paid for 2 years of my tuition at UConn, yet to her, it was just another Tuesday purchase. I understood then that their cruelty wasn't an accident. It was a choice, a daily reinforcement of their hierarchy. My father's 2024 midnight black Tesla Model S sat charging in the driveway, its sleek lines a testament to his belief in progress. Yet he was a man who belonged in the dark ages of patriarchy. He wanted a world where his daughter was a servant and his son was a king, regardless of who actually possessed the crown of intellect. As I closed my laptop and felt the plastic casing, still warm from the processing power it had just exerted, I knew my name, Ilara Vance, would soon be associated with something far more powerful than a burnt application. I was the architect of my own escape, and the blueprint was already executed. My name is Khloe Miller. I am 18 years old, and for the last 4 years, I have been the carefully curated shadow in a house built of glass, steel, and profound indifference. To my father, David Miller, a senior vice president at a global private equity firm in Greenwich, I am not a daughter so much as a line item on a balance sheet that he would very much like to delete. He is a man who navigates the world in $600 Loro Piana summer walk loafers, his every step muffled by the plush, hand-tufted silk rugs of our colonial estate, and he measures the soul of a human being by the prestige of their zip code and the brand of their wristwatch. Then there is my mother, Susan, a woman who considers herself a martyr of the upper class, spending $4,200 every single month on luxury wellness retreats in Sedona or the Berkshires, where she supposedly finds her inner peace while simultaneously complaining that my $50 weekly allowance, money I usually spend on basic hygiene products and used textbooks, is somehow draining the family's liquid resources. The centerpiece of their affection, however, is my 20-year-old brother, Tyler, the undisputed golden child of the Miller dynasty. Tyler is currently enrolled as a pre-med student at a private liberal arts college that commands a staggering $72,000 a year in tuition, despite the fact that he possesses the intellectual depth of a porcelain saucer, and once asked me if Europe was a country or a continent. The disparity of our existences is not merely a quiet tension. It is a loud, daily insult that defines the very air I breathe. While Tyler cruises through the winding, leaf-strewn roads of our affluent Connecticut suburb in a $64,000 Alpine white BMW 5 Series, a motivation gift my father bought him because he managed to pull a C- in organic chemistry, I am the invisible girl walking 2.4 miles in the suffocating, humid New England summer heat. I trudge along the narrow shoulders of the roads, my cheap sneakers wearing thin on the asphalt, headed toward my 11 p.m. graveyard shift at the Harbor Lights Diner. At this greasy spoon, I earn a base pay of $3.15 an hour plus tips, scrubbing congealed maple syrup off Formica tables and serving caffeine-addicted truckers, while my brother sleeps on 800 thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets in a room that is larger than the entire apartment I hope to one day afford. My father's office is a shrine to his ego, smelling of expensive mahogany polish and the faint, peppery scent of the Cohiba cigars he keeps in a climate-controlled humidor. I remember standing in the doorway last week, the cool air of the high-efficiency HVAC system chilling the sweat on my neck from my walk home, as I watched him review Tyler's credit card statement. He didn't even flinch at the $300 steak dinner Tyler had charged to the family account. But when he saw me, His eyes turned into chips of cold flint. He looked at my stained uniform, a polyester blend that smelled of old fryer grease and industrial-strength lemon bleach, and adjusted his gold Patek Philippe Nautilus with a look of visceral disgust. He told me that my choice to work such a low-class job was a personal affront to the Miller name, ignoring the fact that he had refused to pay for my SAT prep courses or even the gas money to visit the state school campuses I dreamed of attending. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because to understand the depth of this betrayal, you have to understand the specific, agonizing detail of a life lived as a second-class citizen in a first-class world. My bedroom is tucked away in the back of the house, a drafty space above the 3-car garage where the insulation is thin, and I can hear every roar of the BMW's engine when Tyler comes home at 2 a.m. after another night of partying. While my mother sits in our designer kitchen, sipping a cold-pressed green juice that costs $12 a bottle and scrolling through Instagram to book her next cryotherapy session, she treats my presence like a stain on the white marble countertops. She once spent an entire dinner lecture explaining how Tyler's future as a surgeon was a communal investment, while my interest in computer science and data architecture was merely a hobby that she hoped I would outgrow so I could find a husband who actually mattered. The injustice is a heavy, physical weight that I carry in the pit of my stomach. I recall a specific Tuesday evening when the humidity was so thick it felt like breathing through a wet wool blanket. I was preparing to leave for my shift, lacing up my shoes, when I saw my father handing Tyler a new set of keys. It was a replacement key fob for the BMW because Tyler had lost the original during a weekend trip to the Hamptons. That key fob alone cost more than my entire month's earnings at the diner, yet my father handed it over with a clap on the back and a reminder that he expected Tyler to represent the family well at the upcoming country club mixer. Tyler looked at me, a smirk playing on his lips, and revved the engine as he backed out of the driveway, deliberately splashing a puddle of stagnant rainwater onto my shins as I started my long walk. I don't complain to them anymore. I realized long ago that the language of my parents is one of wealth and status, and I am speaking a dialect of survival that they have no interest in translating. Every dollar I earn at the diner, every sticky nickel and crumpled $1 bill tipped by a sympathetic regular, goes into a hidden account that I managed to open on my 18th birthday. While they think I am just a failure who likes the smell of grease, I am actually a top-tier coder who spent my high school years in the back of the library, mastering languages they can't even pronounce. I have built a portfolio of freelance security audits under a pseudonym, earning specialized certifications while Tyler was busy failing his intro to biology quizzes. Now, let me take you back to the dinner table last night, a setting of such high-end artifice that it felt like a stage play. The meal was a 24-ounce Wagyu ribeye prepared by a private chef, served on Haviland Limoges china that costs $200 a plate. My mother was talking about the spiritual awakening she had during her last chakra alignment retreat, which cost $5,000, including the private jet share. My father was discussing the market volatility and how his firm was positioning itself to profit from a recent tech merger. Tyler was staring at his phone, probably texting whatever girl he was currently lying to about his GPA. I sat there in silence, my hands still smelling faintly of the orange-scented degreaser I used to clean the diner's industrial vents. My father turned to me, and without a hint of irony, asked why I couldn't be more like Tyler, why I couldn't show the same ambition and drive that my brother possessed. I looked at Tyler's BMW through the panoramic window, the moonlight glinting off its polished hood, and then I looked at my father's Loro Piana loafers. I felt a surge of cold, calculating clarity. They see a disappointment. I see a legacy of unearned privilege that is about to hit a brick wall of reality. My father thinks he is a master of the universe, but he doesn't realize that his own daughter has mapped every digital vulnerability in his personal network. My mother thinks she is enlightened, but she doesn't see the daughter who has learned more about human nature from the 3 a.m. crowd at a diner than she ever will from a yoga mat in Sedona. They have spent years trying to make me feel small, limiting my resources and mocking my efforts, not realizing that by depriving me of their gilded cage, they gave me the tools to dismantle it. The diner shift that night was particularly brutal. The air conditioning had failed, and the temperature near the grill climbed to over 100 degrees. I spent 6 hours on my feet, my uniform sticking to my skin, clearing plates from a family of 6 who left a $4 tip on a $150 tab. As I walked home at 5 a.m., the sun just beginning to bleed over the horizon in shades of bruised purple and pale orange, I passed the gate of our estate. I saw the manicured lawn, the security cameras that I had already bypassed in my mind, and the silent, expensive cars in the driveway. I realized then that family isn't blood. Family is not the people who share your last name while systematically stripping you of your dignity. Family is supposed to be the safety net, but in this house, it is the snare. As I crept into the house, avoiding the third step from the bottom because it squeaks and might wake the golden child, I went to my room and opened my laptop. The screen flickered to life, showing the dashboard of my latest project, a decentralized finance protocol that had already gained 10,000 users in its beta phase. My father thinks I'm too stupid for a real job, and my mother thinks I'm a financial drain. But as the numbers on my screen ticked upward, I knew that I was already wealthier than Tyler would ever be on his own merits. I am Khloe Miller, the girl who walks miles in the dark so she can one day run the world, and as I looked at the 11 p.m. shift schedule for next week, I smiled. They think they are watching me fail, but they are actually just providing the backstory for my triumph. The contrast between the grease on my hands and the gold on theirs is temporary. The brilliance of the mind they ignored is permanent. I sat on my bed, the thin mattress through which I could feel the springs, and listened to the distant sound of a lawnmower starting up on the neighbor's property. A neighbor who paid more for landscaping than my entire life's earnings. I breathed in the scent of the morning air, tinged with the salt of the Atlantic and the exhaust of early commuters, and I knew that every step I took on that 2.4-mile walk was a step closer to a life where I would never have to hear the word disappointment again. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and when my truth finally hits the light, I will be the only one standing in the ruins of the Miller name, holding the keys to a future they were too blinded by their own reflected glory to ever see coming. My name is Khloe Miller, and on that Tuesday night at exactly 8:42 p.m., I stood in the center of our great room and watched the man who provided half of my genetic code attempt to incinerate my entire future with the same casual indifference one might use to discard a gum wrapper. The betrayal wasn't just the physical act of the burning of the papers, it was the total, systematic erasure of my identity as a sentient, capable human being in favor of a narrative that served his fragile ego. My father, David, stood by the massive hearth of our Westport home, his silhouette framed by the flickering orange glow of the birchwood logs that cost $60 a bundle, and as he tossed my hard-earned work into the hungry flames, he didn't even have the decency to meet my eyes. He was too preoccupied with a glossy, heavy-stock brochure for the 2024 BMW M5 competition that he was planning to buy for Tyler, flipping through the pages of leather interior options while my dreams turned into black, curling flakes of carbon. The air in the room was a sickening cocktail of expensive birchwood smoke and the cloying floral notes of my Mother's Joy by Dior perfume, a fragrance that costs $160 for a mere 3 ounces and always seems to linger in the hallway like a ghost of her disapproval. I stood there on the hand-knotted Persian rug, my feet cold despite the radiant floor heating system that kept the slate tiles at a constant 72 degrees, and I felt the sharp sting of my own fingernails digging into my palms until I actually drew blood. The copper scent of my own red cells mixed with the smell of the fire, a private sacrifice that no one in that room noticed because they were too busy worshiping at the altar of the golden boy. David cleared his throat, a sound that usually preceded a lecture on fiscal responsibility or the importance of the Miller legacy, and told me in a voice devoid of any warmth that the world needs people to scrub floors, and that I lacked the intellectual capacity to survive even the most basic collegiate environment. He spoke about my future as if it were a foregone conclusion, a destined path of mediocrity that he was simply helping me accept by destroying the evidence of my ambition. What he didn't realize, and what made the irony of the moment almost unbearable, was that the SAT score he had just consigned to the flames, a miserable, lackluster 980, was a calculated lie I had spent 4 hours carefully crafting during the exam. I had intentionally tanked that test, selecting wrong answers with the precision of a marksman, because I knew that if I showed my true 1,600-point potential, they would find a way to claim it, control it, or crush it. I watched that fake score vanish into the soot, a sacrificial lamb offered to their arrogance, while my real results remained encrypted on a hidden partition of a cloud server they didn't even know existed. They wanted me to be a servant in my own home, a quiet, domestic failure who could be trotted out as a cautionary tale to make Tyler look like a genius by comparison. And in that moment, I realized that my survival depended on my silence. The room felt smaller then, despite the 20-foot ceilings and the panoramic windows that looked out over the meticulously manicured back lawn where the automated sprinkler system was currently pulsing with a rhythmic, expensive hiss. My mother, Susan, sat on the edge of the white velvet armchair, her posture perfect from years of high-end Pilates classes that cost $300 an hour. And she didn't say a single word in my defense. She just adjusted the diamond tennis bracelet on her left wrist, a $50,000 piece of jewelry that caught the firelight and sent dancing prismatic shards across the ceiling, and sighed as if my very presence were an exhausting chore. To them, I was a broken tool, a disappointment that had to be managed and minimized so as not to embarrass them at the next country club gala or the annual charity auction at the yacht club. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because that 8:42 p.m. timestamp became the 0 hour of my new life, the exact second I stopped seeking their validation and started planning their downfall. While David was discussing the technical specifications of Tyler's new car, the carbon fiber trim, the Bowers & Wilkins diamond surround sound system, the twin-turbo V8 engine, I was mentally cataloging every password, every security flaw, and every financial inconsistency I had uncovered in the months leading up to this confrontation. I decided right then to give them exactly what they wanted. I would play the role of the dim-witted daughter, the girl who couldn't balance a checkbook or understand a spreadsheet, while I quietly moved my chess pieces across a board they couldn't even see. I would be the one to clear the dinner plates, the one to endure the snide comments about my waitress shifts at the diner, and the one to walk the 2.4 miles in the drenching Connecticut humidity, all while building a digital fortress that would eventually render their Westport estate a house of cards. The detail of their cruelty was etched into the very architecture of the house, the way the kitchen lighting was dimmed when I entered, the way the groceries I liked were never on the list because the pantry was reserved for Tyler's high-protein supplements and my mother's organic kale chips, and the way my father's 2024 midnight black Tesla Model S would glide out of the driveway in the morning without even a glance toward my window. They believed they were watching my future turn to ash in that fireplace, but they were actually watching the birth of the person who would take everything away from them. I remember the sound of the brochure hitting the mahogany coffee table, a dull, expensive thud that punctuated David's finality, and the way he walked toward the wet bar to pour himself a glass of 20-year-old Pappy Van Winkle bourbon, which retails for nearly $5,000 a bottle if you can even find it. He didn't offer me a seat, he didn't offer me a glass of water, and he certainly didn't offer me an apology for burning the only document he thought represented my hope for an education. I turned away from the fire, the heat still radiating against my back, and walked toward the servants' stairs that led to my small, cramped bedroom above the garage. Each step on the cold hardwood felt like a vow, a silent promise that for every dollar they wasted on Tyler's incompetence, I would earn 10 in the shadows. I reached my room and locked the door, the click of the deadbolt sounding like a gunshot in the quiet house, and I sat down at my desk, a cheap, wobbly piece of furniture I'd found at a thrift store in Norwalk for $15. I pulled out my laptop, the fan whirring to life as it struggled to process the complex algorithms I was running to stress test my father's corporate firewall. The contrast was stark. Downstairs was a world of marble, silk, and unearned privilege, and up here was a world of code, grit, and the kind of cold, calculating intelligence that David Miller could never understand because he had never had to fight for anything in his life. I looked at the small clock on my screen, the digits flickering from 8:59 to 9 p.m., and I realized that my father's words about the world needing floor scrubbers were technically true, but he had misidentified the person who would eventually be doing the cleaning. Soon, the floors he walked on with his $600 Loro Piana loafers wouldn't belong to him anymore, and the sister he mocked would be the one holding the deed to his pride. Family isn't blood. It isn't a name engraved on a mailbox or a shared history of dinners where the only thing served is a side of psychological warfare. Family is the person who sees your worth and protects it. And since no one in this house was willing to do that for me, I had become my own protector, my own advocate, and my own greatest secret. I began to type, the rhythmic clack of the keys a soothing counterpoint to the distant roar of the wind against the garage, and as the lines of green code scrolled across my vision, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. They wanted a servant, and I would give them one. The most efficient, invisible, and dangerous servant they could ever imagine, until the day I decided the service was over and the bill was due in full. I thought back to the way my mother had looked at her watch during the whole ordeal, that Bulgari Serpenti that cost more than a year of my life's expenses, and I felt a surge of pure, refined adrenaline. She was waiting for the evening to be over so she could retire to her silk sheets and her luxury sleep mask, completely unaware that the daughter she treated as an inconvenience was currently rerouting the digital flow of their lifestyle. The real moral of the story wasn't about the fire in the hearth. It was about the fire in the girl who had been pushed too far. I was Khloe Miller, 18 years old, a genius disguised as a failure, a coder disguised as a waitress, and a threat disguised as a victim. As I finally closed my laptop at midnight, the smell of the birchwood smoke still clinging to my hair, I knew that the next time my father threw something into a fire, it wouldn't be my application. It would be the remains of his own reputation, and I would be the one holding the matches. The Westport estate felt like a tomb that night, a mausoleum for the people they used to be and the person they thought I was. And as I lay down on my thin, lumpy mattress, I smiled for the first time in months. "The world does need people to scrub the floors, Dad," I whispered into the darkness, "and I can't wait to watch you learn how to hold a mop." My name is Khloe Miller, and at exactly 3:14 a.m., while the rest of the Miller estate was blanketed in the heavy, expensive silence of a Connecticut midnight, I was sitting on the cold hardwood floor of my cramped reach-in closet with nothing but a $50 pawn shop Lenovo laptop and a clarity of purpose that was sharper than any blade. The air in the closet was stale, smelling faintly of the mothballs my mother insisted on using for her vintage fur coats and the lingering scent of the lemon-scented industrial degreaser that had seeped into my skin during my double shift at the diner. I didn't cry because tears are a luxury for those who still believe that someone is coming to save them, and I didn't vent my frustrations into a pillow because I couldn't afford the noise or the wasted energy. Instead, I opened a simple, cold, and devastatingly honest spreadsheet on my flickering screen, the blue light reflecting off my glasses and illuminating the peeling wallpaper behind me. This was the ledger of my life, a mathematical deconstruction of the power dynamics in this house, and as I stared at the blinking cursor, I began to categorize our existences into two distinct and irreconcilable columns. Column A was titled Their Assets, and it was a staggering list of material wealth that my father, David, and my mother, Susan, used as both a shield and a weapon against the world. I typed in the estimated market value of our Westport estate, a sprawling $4.2 million colonial with hand-carved crown molding and a heated saltwater pool that required a $200 weekly maintenance fee just to keep the pH levels balanced. I added the $1.2 million brokerage account that I had seen my father monitoring on his triple monitor setup in his home office, a portfolio heavy with tech stocks and real estate investment trusts that grew by thousands of dollars while he slept in his Italian silk sheets. I included Tyler's $64,000 Alpine white BMW 5 Series and the $72,000 in annual tuition they were flushing away on his remedial education, alongside my mother's $4,200 monthly wellness retreats that never seemed to actually make her a better person. It was a column of gold, brick, and status, a mountain of capital built on the assumption that money could buy the appearance of a perfect family. Column B, however, was titled My Assets, and while it contained no liquid currency and no deed to a property, it was the most dangerous document in the entire house. I typed in my 1,600 SAT score, a perfect result that I had hidden under a loose floorboard like a criminal would hide a kilo of contraband. I added my regional finalist spot in the Intel Science Talent Search, a prestigious accolade that I had earned under a pseudonym so my father wouldn't find out and find a way to take credit for it. And then I typed the most important entry of all, a secret acceptance letter to Stanford University with a full-ride scholarship worth $320,000 over 4 years. This was my exit strategy, my golden ticket, and a total validation of the intellect they had spent 18 years trying to convince me I didn't possess. Staring at these two columns, I realized with a cold, hollow sensation in my chest that love was not something I could ever buy from them with a 4.0 GPA or a perfect test score. They didn't want a brilliant daughter. They wanted a convenient failure, a foil to Tyler's manufactured success, and a domestic servant who would never challenge the hierarchy of their gilded cage. I reached for my chipped ceramic mug, which was filled with lukewarm tap water that tasted faintly of the aging copper pipes in the garage wing of the house, and I took a slow, deliberate sip as I made the hardest choice of my life. I decided right then, in the suffocating darkness of that closet, that I would play the role of the stupid daughter for exactly 90 more days. I would lean into their insults, I would absorb their condescension, and I would become the invisible background noise of their opulent lives. I decided that I would spend the next 3 months cleaning their bathroom grout with a toothbrush, feeling the abrasive bristles against my knuckles and the sting of the bleach in my eyes, while my mind was light years away. I would serve their dinner in absolute silence, placing the $200 Haviland Limoges china plates in front of them with the practiced humility of a ghost, never once letting the fire in my eyes betray the fact that I was currently finalizing the patent for my cancer detection algorithm. This algorithm, a project I had titled Project Sentinel, was a neural network optimization script that could analyze medical imaging data to detect stage 1 carcinomas with a 99.4% accuracy rate, a piece of technology that was worth more than every single asset listed in column A. While my father was downstairs sipping his $5,000 Pappy Van Winkle bourbon and complaining that I lacked the intellectual capacity to survive a community college, I was secretly communicating with patent attorneys in Palo Alto and coordinating the final benchmarks for my software. The contrast was almost hallucinatory. In one reality, I was a girl who earned $3.15 an hour scrubbing grease traps at a diner and was told she was a drain on the family resources. In the other reality, I was a revolutionary data scientist who was about to disrupt a multi-billion-dollar medical industry. I sat there on the floor, my legs cramping and my back aching from the hunched position, and I felt a sense of power that was far more intoxicating than anything my father had ever felt in a boardroom. Now, let me take you back to the specific texture of that evening's humiliation, which had served as the catalyst for this 3:14 a.m. revelation. At dinner, my mother had complained that the silver was looking dull and demanded that I spend my Saturday, my only day off from the diner, polishing the entire 50-piece collection of 1920s Tiffany & Company service. My father had chimed in, saying it was a good way for me to learn the value of hard work, since my academic prospects were so dismal. Tyler had just smirked, his mouth full of prime rib, and asked if I could also detail the interior of his BMW because he'd spilled a mocha latte on the leather seats. I had simply nodded, keeping my gaze lowered to my own plate of leftover vegetables, and said, "Yes, Dad, of course, Tyler." But in my head, I was already calculating the data throughput required for the Sentinel beta test. I was acting on facts now, not emotions. The fact was that they would never change. The fact was that their pride was tied to my perceived failure. The fact was that in 90 days, I would turn 19, the legal paperwork for my patent would be filed, and I would be on a one-way flight to San Francisco with a bank account they couldn't touch. I looked at the spreadsheet one last time before closing the laptop. The numbers didn't lie. Column A was a house built on sand, an aging legacy of real estate and traditional manufacturing that was being eroded by a changing economy. Column B was the future. I was the future. The room smelled of old clothes and the metallic tang of the cheap laptop battery, but I felt like I was breathing the cleanest air in the world. I stood up, my joints popping in the silence, and crept out of the closet to my thin mattress. I pulled the worn cotton sheet up to my chin and listened to the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. 89 days and 20 hours left. I would endure the smell of the diner grease, the weight of the silver polish, and the sting of their words, because every insult was just fuel for the engine I was building. I would be the most obedient, most silent, and most invisible daughter they had ever seen. I would be the perfect servant, the one who anticipated their every need and accepted their every criticism with a dull, vacant stare. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the toothbrush I would use to clean the grout in the morning. I would focus on the rhythmic motion, the tiny bubbles of soap, and the precision required to make the porcelain shine. I would do it perfectly, not for them, but for the discipline of it. I would be a master of the mundane while being a god of the digital, and when the 90 days were up, I wouldn't just leave, I would vanish, leaving behind a house full of people who finally realized they had spent 20 years mocking the only person who actually understood how the world worked. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who see your brilliance and nourish it. And since my family was blind, I would let them stay in the dark until the very moment the light of my success burned their world to the ground. I closed my eyes. The image of the spreadsheet burned into my retinas, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly, undeniably wealthy. I was Khloe Miller, the girl who would soon be known by a different name in a different city, and my 90-day countdown had just begun with a sip of lukewarm water and a spreadsheet that proved I had already won. My name is Khloe Miller, and as the winter frost began to etch delicate, skeletal patterns onto the triple-paned windows of our Westport estate, I began the meticulous process of gathering my arsenal, transforming my perceived insignificance into a tactical advantage that my father could never have anticipated in his wildest, most arrogant dreams. I didn't make the mistake of going to a high school counselor or a local teacher who might have felt a misplaced sense of duty to report my brilliance to my parents. Instead, I reached out to the only person in Tyler's orbit who possessed a functional intellect: Simone, his 26-year-old girlfriend, a PhD pharmacist who worked at a high-end research lab in New Haven and was the only one smart enough to see through the gray rock act I had been perfecting for months. We met on a rainy Tuesday in a dimly lit corner of a Starbucks in Fairfield, far enough away from our social circles that we wouldn't be spotted by one of my mother's yoga friends or my father's golf partners. The air in the coffee shop was thick with the scent of burnt espresso and the humid dampness of wet umbrellas, a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled perfection of the Miller household. Simone sat across from me, her professional attire a sharp contrast to my oversized thrift store hoodie that I wore to hide my frame, and I watched her expression shift from polite confusion to absolute, soul-shattering shock as I pushed a stack of grease-stained diner napkins across the scarred wooden table. On those napkins, written in the cramped, precise script of a person who had spent her graveyard shifts at the Harbor Lights Diner, thinking in multidimensional arrays, were the back-propagation algorithms for my cancer detection neural network, the mathematical heartbeat of Project Sentinel. Simone's jaw literally dropped, her eyes scanning the complex partial derivatives and the weight adjustment logic I had scribbled between orders of blueberry pancakes and over-easy eggs. And for the first time in 18 years, someone looked at me not as a disappointment, but as a peer. She looked up at me, her hands trembling slightly as she held a napkin that contained a more elegant solution to data normalization than most of the senior researchers at her firm could produce. And she became my secret ally, my silent partner in the shadows. She began providing the high-level professional references and peer reviews I needed to finalize my patent applications, acting as a bridge between the girl who scrubbed floors and the scientific community that was about to be rocked by my discovery. While the world saw a quiet girl who rarely spoke and spent her afternoons polishing her mother's collection of 1920s Tiffany and Comber silver service, I was actually organizing what I internally referred to as the Manila Folder of Death, a comprehensive, devastating dossier of the Miller family's hypocrisy and decay. This wasn't just a collection of my own triumphs, such as my 1,600 SAT score and the official acceptance letter from the dean of Stanford University offering me a $320,000 full-ride scholarship. It was a forensic audit of the Golden Boys' systematic theft. I had spent my nights at the diner using the public Wi-Fi to trace the digital breadcrumbs Tyler left behind, compiling bank statements that proved his $12,000 textbook fund, which my father had proudly touted at the last country club mixer, had actually been diverted through a Venmo chain to pay for a pair of high-performance Sea-Doo jet skis in Daytona Beach during his last spring break. I documented the $400 an hour my father was still paying for a tutor who was essentially writing Tyler's papers for him, and the falsified medical records my mother had used to secure him extra time on exams he was too lazy to study for. I kept this entire arsenal, the folders, the encrypted flash drives, the Stanford letter, and the patent drafts, inside a black, waterproof Pelican 1,200 protector case that I had purchased with tips from a particularly busy Sunday morning at the diner. I didn't hide it in my room because I knew my mother occasionally sent the cleaning crew in to check for dust or hidden clutter that didn't fit her aesthetic. Instead, I climbed the pull-down ladder into the attic, navigating the sea of holiday decorations and discarded designer furniture until I reached a remote corner near the north gable. There, tucked deep inside the pink fiberglass insulation where the air was dusty and smelled of old wood and forgotten dreams, I stashed my future. Every time I had to endure another dinner where David mocked my lack of intellectual capacity, or Tyler kicked my shins under the table while asking for more gravy, I would close my eyes and visualize that Pelican case, a ticking time bomb of truth waiting for the 90-day clock to hit zero. The contrast between the life I was performing and the life I was building was becoming a physical strain, a high-wire act where one slip of the tongue could send my entire plan into the abyss. I remember one specific evening when the humidity was so high that the salt in the shakers at the diner had clumped together, and I had spent 8 hours serving a never-ending stream of disgruntled travelers. I came home at midnight, my back screaming in protest and my hands smelling of industrial-strength lemon bleach, only to find my father standing in the kitchen in his $600 Loro Piana loafers, pouring himself a double of Macallan 18. He looked at me with such profound, casual disdain, noting the grease stain on my collar, and remarked that it was a shame I didn't have the drive to even keep a uniform clean, let alone manage a real career like Tyler was preparing for. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply apologized for the mess and walked past him, my heart hammering a rhythmic code against my ribs. 82 days, 81 days, 80 days. Now, let me take you back to a moment of pure, crystalline irony that occurred just 3 days after my meeting with Simone. My father had invited a group of his executive partners over for a catered dinner to celebrate a minor real estate acquisition, and I was expected to act as an unofficial server, moving through the crowd with trays of bacon-wrapped dates and miniature crab cakes that cost more per bite than I earned in an hour. One of the guests, a senior venture capitalist who specialized in medical technology, began discussing the limitations of current diagnostic AI, lamenting the high rate of false positives in early-stage breast cancer detection. I stood there, holding a silver tray that felt like it weighed 50 pounds, and listened as he described exactly the problem that Project Sentinel had already solved. My father laughed, clapped the man on the back, and gestured toward me, saying that he wished his daughter could understand half of what they were talking about, but that she was more suited for the hospitality industry. Simone was standing nearby, her hand tightening around her wine glass as she caught my eye, a secret smile playing on her lips that was the only thing keeping me from dropping the tray and explaining the mathematics of backpropagation right there on the white marble floor. But I am getting ahead of myself, because the real power of the manila folder of death wasn't just in the facts it contained, it was in the patience it required to keep it closed. I spent my mornings cleaning the grout in the master bathroom with a toothbrush, the bristles wearing down to nubs as I scrubbed away the invisible grime of their entitlement, all while running mental simulations of the patent defense I would eventually have to mount. I watched my mother spend $4,200 on a new set of outdoor furniture from Restoration Hardware that she didn't need, while I secretly calculated the compound interest on the $5,000 I had managed to save from my diner shifts and freelance coding gigs. I was a ghost in my own home, a silent observer of a family that was disintegrating from the inside out, held together only by the glue of my father's vanity and the weight of his bank account. The pelican case in the attic became my sanctuary, a physical anchor for my sanity during the long, suffocating weeks of the Connecticut winter. Occasionally, I would sneak up there at 3 a.m, the floorboards creaking under my feet like a warning, and I would open the case just to see the Stanford logo and the official seal on my patent application. It was proof that I existed, proof that the girl they called stupid was actually a ghost in the machine that was about to rewrite their history. Family isn't blood. Family is not the group of people who use your silence as a canvas for their own insecurities. Family is supposed to be the people who see the fire in you and help it grow. But in the Miller house, the only fire they cared about was the one in the fireplace where they burned my dreams. They thought they were the masters of their domain, but they were actually just temporary residents in a house that I had already deconstructed, brick by digital brick. As I sat in the attic one night, the cold air seeping through the roof and making my breath visible in the dim light of my flashlight, I looked at the bank statements proving Tyler's Daytona spending spree and felt a surge of cold, analytical satisfaction. David Miller prided himself on being a predator in the boardroom, a man who could spot a weakness a mile away, yet he was blind to the fact that his own son was a parasite and his daughter was a predator of a much higher order. I was building a future out of napkins and grit, while they were living a life of silk and lies. The 90-day countdown was no longer a burden. It was a symphony, and I was the conductor, waiting for the final movement to begin. I closed the pelican case, clicking the latches into place with a sound that felt as final as a gavel, and descended the ladder back into the world of grease, bleach, and forced humility. I would be the girl who cleaned their floors for a few more weeks, but I was already miles away, standing on the campus of a university they couldn't even dream of attending on their own merits, holding a patent that would change the world and a folder that would end theirs. My name is Khloe Miller, and on Thanksgiving evening, as the sun dipped below the frost-covered oaks of our Westport estate, I stood in the shadows of the dining hall and watched the architecture of a lie reach its peak. The trap was set, not by my father for the benefit of his peers, but by me for the benefit of the truth. My parents had invited 22 people, the absolute upper crust of high society Westport neighbors, including venture capitalists, retired judges, and the kind of women who spend the price of a mid-sized sedan on a single charity auction table. The catering alone had cost $5,400, a lavish spread prepared by a 3-star Michelin chef who had taken over our kitchen since dawn, filling the air with the rich, heavy, and almost suffocating scent of a $400 truffle-infused heritage turkey. The table was a museum exhibit of unearned wealth, set with the full collection of 1920s Tiffany & Co. silverware that I had spent 6 hours polishing until my knuckles were raw and my vision was blurred. Each fork and spoon sat with mathematical precision on hand-pressed Irish linen runners, reflecting the amber glow of the Waterford crystal chandeliers overhead. The evening's intended climax was a grand performance of parental pride. My father, David, had spent the last week rehearsing the narrative of Tyler's early acceptance into a prestigious medical internship at a world-renowned research hospital in New York. It was a milestone that would have been impressive if it were real, but I knew for a fact that Tyler had spent 3 days hunched over his laptop using a bootleg version of Photoshop to forge the acceptance letter, even going so far as to spoof the digital signature of the Dean of Medicine. My parents were so desperate for a win, so blinded by their need to have a golden boy who justified their investment, that they didn't even check the metadata of the file. They just saw the logo and the word accepted and started making a guest list. My role in this theater of the absurd was clearly defined. I was tasked with wearing a plain, high-collared black dress that resembled a maid's uniform, a deliberate choice by my mother to ensure I didn't distract from the aesthetic of the evening. I was the invisible daughter, the ghost in the machine, tasked with the silent, perpetual refilling of wine glasses with a 2018 Opus 1 Cabernet Sauvignon that retailed for nearly $400 a bottle. I moved through the room with practiced, silent steps, my sneakers replaced by cheap black flats that pinched my toes, weaving between the Westport elite as they discussed their offshore accounts and their summer homes in Provence. I could smell the expensive Joy by Dior perfume radiating from my mother as she glided through the crowd, her face a mask of Botoxed perfection, and the peppery scent of my father's pre-dinner cigar clinging to his tailored tuxedo. I caught glimpses of Tyler throughout the hour, looking flushed and sweating slightly in his tight-fitting suit, his eyes darting toward the bar every few minutes. He looked like a man who knew he was standing on a trapdoor, but he was too addicted to the praise to step off it. Every time a neighbor patted him on the back and called him a future lifesaver, a dark, cold part of me counted down the minutes. I was the one who had cleared the dinner plates, the one who had fetched the artisanal clear ice for the cocktails, and the one who had endured my father's whispered command to stay out of the way when the important people were talking. I was the failure, the dropout, the disappointment, and yet I was the only person in that room who truly knew what was about to happen. At exactly 7:15 p.m., the atmosphere in the room shifted as David stood up at the head of the 24-foot mahogany table. The chatter died down to a respectful hum as he picked up a silver spoon and began tapping it against his crystal glass, a sharp, melodic ringing that cut through the scent of truffles and expensive wine like a blade. He looked every bit the successful patriarch, his silver hair catching the light, his gold Patek Philippe watch gleaming on his wrist. He cleared his throat, a sound of profound self-importance, and prepared to make his grand announcement about his brilliant son, the heir to the Miller legacy. I stood in the corner near the velvet curtains, a bottle of wine held loosely in my hand, watching the reflection of the fire in the panoramic windows. This was the moment I had been preparing for during those 3:14 a.m. sessions in my closet. This was the moment where the facts in my manila folder of death would finally collide with the fiction of my father's ego. Now, let me take you back to the micro details of that specific moment, the way the light hit the silver and the way Tyler leaned forward, his face a mixture of terror and triumph. My mother sat to David's right, her hands clasped under her chin, her Bulgari diamond ring sparkling with a ferocity that seemed to mock the very idea of humility. She looked at Tyler with a hunger, a desperate need for him to be the person she had told everyone he was. I looked at the guest at the end of the table, the same medical technology venture capitalist who had discussed AI diagnostics weeks earlier, and I saw him lean in, genuinely interested in the news of a new medical prodigy. The injustice of it was so thick I could almost taste it, more bitter than the dregs of the wine I had been pouring. They were celebrating a fraud, while the person who had actually solved the diagnostic problems they were discussing was standing 2 feet away, ready to be told to go fetch more bread rolls. But I am getting ahead of myself, because the silence in the room after the tapping stopped was the most profound silence I had ever experienced in the Miller household. It was the silence of a vacuum, a space waiting to be filled by my father's lies. He began to speak, his voice booming with a manufactured warmth, talking about the importance of tradition, the weight of the Miller name, and how proud he was to see the next generation taking up the mantle of excellence. He spoke about Tyler's supposed late nights of studying, the same nights I knew Tyler had spent at underground clubs in New York City using the gas money David gave him. He spoke about Tyler's passion for healing, while Tyler was currently nursing a hangover from a pre-Thanksgiving bender. It was a masterpiece of delusion, a carefully constructed alternate reality where the golden boy was a saint and I was merely a footnote in a story of success. I felt the weight of the flash drive in my pocket, a small piece of plastic and metal that contained the evidence of Tyler's forgery, the receipts for the jet skis, and the high-resolution scans of my own Stanford acceptance letter. I also had the credentials for the server where I had hosted the live demo of Project Sentinel, my cancer detection algorithm. I watched as David reached for a printed copy of the forged internship letter, intending to pass it around the table like a trophy. My heart was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. I wasn't the scared girl who had watched her application burn in the fireplace anymore. I was the architect of the demolition. I had cleaned their grout, I had served their wine, and I had played the stupid daughter until my throat ached from the silence. Now, the 90-day clock was at 0, and the high society neighbors of Westport were about to receive a much more interesting story than the one my father was telling. The smell of the turkey was cloying now, a reminder of the excess that defined this family. My father turned his gaze toward Tyler, gesturing for him to stand, and the room erupted into a polite, anticipatory applause. I saw Simone at the far end of the table, her eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second. She knew. She was the only one who saw the ghost in the black dress for who she really was. My father took a deep breath, his chest swelling with the pride of a man who thinks he has won everything. He opened his mouth to say the words that would officially crown Tyler as the family's greatest achievement, and I stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains. I didn't run, I didn't scream. I simply walked toward the side table where the digital projector for the family's annual holiday slideshow was already plugged in and waiting. Family isn't blood. Family is not the people who dress you in a servant's clothes to hide your light from their friends. Family is supposed to be the truth, and the truth was about to be projected onto the $40,000 white silk wallpaper of the dining room. As my father's voice filled the room with the first sentence of his announcement, "I want to share some truly remarkable news regarding my son," I reached out and pressed the power button on the remote. The hum of the projector fan was the only warning they had. I stood there, the invisible daughter, the girl they thought lacked the intellectual capacity to survive, and I waited for the first slide to appear. It wasn't a picture of Tyler at graduation. It was a side-by-side comparison of the real internship letter template and Tyler's poorly edited Photoshop file, followed immediately by my own perfect SAT scores and the Stanford seal. The contrast was a physical blow, a sudden, violent intrusion of reality into their gilded fantasy. David's voice trailed off, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the wall, and for the first time in 18 years, the room was truly silent. I am Khloe Miller, and the dinner was just beginning. My name is Khloe Miller, and as the clock in the grand hallway of our Westport estate struck the quarter hour, the air in the dining room became so thick with artifice that it felt like it might actually shatter under the weight of my father's next breath. This was the execution, the moment where the years of being treated like a peripheral character in my own life came to a violent, silent end. My father, David, was standing at the head of the 24-foot mahogany table, his face flushed with the kind of self-congratulatory glow that only a man who believes he has successfully engineered a legacy can possess. He began his planned speech about superior DNA and the innate excellence of the Miller bloodline, his voice resonating against the white silk wallpaper as he gestured toward Tyler with a look of absolute, unearned triumph. But before he could reach the crescendo of his lies, the high-pitched crystalline ring of the house phone, a vintage-style Bang & Olufsen handset that cost $1,200, cut through the room like a physical blade. I had coordinated this call weeks in advance with the admissions office at Stanford, providing them with this specific window of time to verify my enrollment details, knowing exactly how my mother would react to an official caller from Palo Alto. My mother, Susan, reached for the handset with a confused smile, her thin fingers adorned with a $50,000 diamond tennis bracelet, trembling slightly as she pressed the phone to her ear. I watched the color drain from her face with a clinical fascination, seeing the blood retreat from her cheeks so quickly that even her $120 Giorgio Armani Crema Nuda foundation couldn't hide the sudden gray pallor of her skin. The shock was so profound that she actually stumbled back against her velvet-upholstered chair, her eyes widening as the voice of the dean of admissions at Stanford University filled the silence of the room. I didn't wait for her to find the words to speak, or for my father to demand an explanation for the interruption of his grand moment. I moved with the silent, predatory grace of someone who had spent 90 days rehearsing for this exact second, walking directly to the head of the table where the $400 truffle-infused turkey sat cooling in its own expensive juices. Underneath the heavy silver serving tray I had been carrying as part of my maid-style performance, I had concealed 22 professionally bound dossiers, the physical manifestation of my manila folder of death. I began distributing them to the guests, sliding them onto the Haviland Limoges china plates like they were the evening's final bitter course, ensuring that every venture capitalist, retired judge, and high society neighbor had a clear view of the data. Since we are talking about DNA, I said, and my voice was as cold and sharp as the November wind rattling the triple-paned windows of the estate, let us look at the actual data that defines this family's intellectual output. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room until the only thing left was the rhythmic, frantic beating of my own heart. One of the neighbors, a senior partner at a law firm in Greenwich, dropped her silver Tiffany & Co. fork, and the sound of the heavy metal clattering against the fine porcelain echoed through the vaulted ceiling like a gunshot, punctuating the end of the Miller family's carefully curated fantasy. On the very first page of the dossier, printed in high-resolution ink, was a side-by-side comparison that stripped away every layer of my father's pride. On the left was my official Stanford University full-ride scholarship offer, a $320,000 validation of my genius, and on the right was Tyler's actual 1.8 GPA transcript from his private college, complete with the failing marks in the very science classes he claimed to be mastering. I stood at the head of the table, looking down at my father, who was still holding his crystal wine glass as if it were a scepter, though his hand was now shaking so violently that the 2018 Opus 1 was splashing against the rim. I didn't let him speak. I didn't give him the chance to craft a new lie or to deflect the shame onto me as he had done for 18 years. Instead, I opened my own copy of the dossier and began to read the dean's personal note aloud, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the stagnant air of the dining room. Khloe, your work on neural network optimization and its application in stage 1 carcinoma detection is the most advanced we have seen from an undergraduate applicant in over a decade, and we are honored to welcome a mind of your caliber to our institution. The words hung in the air, a physical weight that seemed to crush the breath out of David and Susan. My father tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no sound came out of his throat. He looked at the documents in front of him, seeing the 1,600 SAT score and the patent filings for Project Sentinel, and then he looked at his golden son. Tyler was currently staring at his own lap, his shoulders hunched and his face a mask of humiliated defeat, The truth of his Photoshop forgeries and his $12,000 jet ski spending spree now laid bare for the entire Westport elite to see. The contrast was absolute and devastating. The daughter they had called stupid, the girl they had forced to walk 2.4 miles to a diner shift while they mocked her intellectual capacity, was the only one in the room with a future that wasn't bought and paid for with inherited capital. I looked at my mother, whose hand was still clutching the phone as if it were a lifeline, and I saw the realization dawn on her that the waitress she had treated like a domestic servant was now the most successful person to ever carry the Miller name. Now, let me take you back to the micro details of the sensory environment in that room, because the smell of the birchwood smoke from the fireplace and the cloying scent of the Joy by Dior perfume now felt like the atmosphere of a funeral. The 22 guests, people who had spent their entire lives judging others by the thickness of their wallets and the prestige of their connections, were staring at the data with a hungry, predatory curiosity. They weren't looking at my father with respect anymore. They were looking at him with the pitying gaze one reserves for a man who has been exposed as a fool. My father's $600 Loro Piana loafers felt small and insignificant against the cold reality of my achievements, and the $4,200 wellness retreats my mother frequented couldn't provide the inner peace she needed to survive this level of public exposure. I was no longer the girl who cleaned their grout with a toothbrush or the girl who served their dinner in silence. I was the architect of their social assassination, and I had performed the task with the same mathematical precision I used to write my backpropagation algorithms. I watched as David finally managed to set his glass down on the mahogany table, the crystal making a sharp, hollow click that signaled his total loss of control. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see disdain or disappointment in his eyes. I saw fear. He was afraid of the mind he had tried to suppress, afraid of the daughter who had spent 90 days hiding in a closet with a $50 laptop to build an empire that would eclipse his own. He looked at the neighbor who was a medical technology venture capitalist, a man whose opinion David valued more than his own daughter's happiness, and he saw that the man was already looking at me with a professional intensity. Ignore Tyler completely. The execution was complete. The narrative had been flipped, and the silence of the room was the sound of a legacy turning into gray ash in the center of a 5-figure Thanksgiving dinner. There was no going back from this moment, no way for them to spin the truth or to burn these documents as they had burned my Yukon application. I had distributed the truth like a virus, and it had already infected every person at that table, ensuring that by tomorrow morning, the entire Westport community would know that David Miller's son was a fraud and his daughter was a prodigy they had tried to break. I stood tall, the black maid-style dress no longer a symbol of my servitude, but a uniform of my victory, and I realized that family isn't blood. Family is not the people who share your DNA and use it as a justification for psychological warfare. Family is the person who stands up when the truth comes out, and as I looked around the room, I realized that I was the only person standing with any real dignity. I took one last look at the $400 turkey, the Tiffany silverware, and the broken people who had tried to define me, and I felt a sense of freedom that was more valuable than every asset in column A of my spreadsheet. The silence continued to stretch, punctuated only by the distant hum of the expensive HVAC system and the soft, repetitive sobbing of my mother, which was a sound I had waited years to hear. Not because I was cruel, but because it was the sound of her finally recognizing the reality of her own choices. David finally found his voice, a weak, reedy whisper that sounded nothing like the man who had mocked me at 8:42 p.m. on that Tuesday night, and he asked me why I would do this to them in front of their friends. I didn't answer him with a scream or a lecture. I simply picked up the empty bottle of Opus One, set it back on the serving tray, and looked him directly in the eyes. "I didn't do this to you, Dad," I said, my voice projecting with the confidence of a woman who had already won her full ride to the future. "I just stopped pretending that your lies were the truth, and as it turns out, the truth doesn't need a $400 an hour tutor to explain itself." I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room, leaving the 22 guests to finish their dossiers, knowing that while they would eventually leave the estate, the memory of this execution would haunt my parents for the rest of their lives in the house that I had already, metaphorically, burned to the ground. My name is Khloe Miller, and the aftermath of that Thanksgiving execution was not a loud explosion, but a clinical, cold-blooded demolition of a legacy built on the hollow pillars of unearned prestige and systematic gaslighting. As the echoes of my voice faded in the dining room and the 22 neighbors began to whisper behind their linen napkins, I didn't stick around to witness the pathetic attempts at damage control or my mother's inevitable hysterics over the ruined social standing of the Miller name. I walked straight up the servants' stairs to my cramped bedroom above the garage, a space that had felt like a prison cell for 18 years, but now felt like a temporary transit lounge. I moved out that very night, packing my life into a single, scuffed hardshell suitcase I'd bought for $30 at a Goodwill in Norwalk, leaving behind the designer clothes my mother had bought me to ensure I looked the part of a silent accessory. I left with my documents, my cheap laptop, and the $4,300 in cash I had meticulously saved from 4 years of grueling shifts at the Harbor Lights Diner and secret freelance coding gigs. As I descended the stairs for the last time, the house smelled of cooling truffle turkey and the metallic tang of a dying fire, a scent that I knew would forever be associated with the day I reclaimed my soul from the people who tried to bury it. The fallout for the Golden Boy was swift and devoid of the mercy he had come to expect. Tyler lost the keys to his $64,000 Alpine white BMW 5 Series within 48 hours of my departure. My father, David, driven by a mixture of public humiliation and the sudden realization that he had been financially and emotionally scammed by his own son, revoked every privilege Tyler possessed with a clinical fury. The BMW was towed from the driveway on a rainy Saturday morning, its high-performance engine silent as it was repossessed by the man who had bought it as a motivation gift for a genius who didn't exist. My father, the senior VP who prided himself on his ability to read a balance sheet, finally understood that his greatest investment was a fraudulent liability, and the son he had championed was nothing more than a parasite with a copy of Photoshop and a sense of entitlement that had finally hit a brick wall. In the first 7 days of my new life, my phone became a digital graveyard of my parents' desperation, recording 14 missed calls and a barrage of text messages that shifted in tone from indignant commands to pathetic pleas for a conversation. They weren't calling to apologize for the years of emotional neglect or the burning of my applications. They were calling because the news had broken in certain professional circles that my patent for Project Sentinel, the cancer detection algorithm they called a hobby, had been valued at a mid-7-figure sum by a leading venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. They were sharks who could smell the sudden influx of blood in the water, and they were looking for a loan to bridge the gap in their own crumbling empire, hoping that the daughter they had treated like a domestic servant would now serve as their financial savior. I didn't engage, I didn't argue, and I certainly didn't provide them with the satisfaction of a response. I simply blocked their numbers and their email addresses, severing the digital umbilical cord that had tied me to their Westport estate. Before I went completely dark, however, I sent one final meticulously drafted email to my father's corporate account, an electronic ghost that I knew would haunt his professional reputation for years to come. Attached to the email was a formal, itemized invoice for 4 years of domestic services I had performed under the guise of daughterly duty, scrubbing the marble floors, polishing the silver, cleaning the grout in their 5 bathrooms with a toothbrush, and serving their high society dinners in silence. I calculated the total at a standard market rate of $18 an hour for an average of 30 hours a week over 208 weeks, totaling exactly $112,320. In the body of the email, I wrote a single devastating sentence. Since you believe the world needs people to scrub floors, I expect to be paid for the time I spent cleaning yours. I'll see you in the news headlines, but I will never see you at Christmas again. Now, let me take you to my current reality, which is as far removed from the opulence of Westport as a person can travel while remaining on the same planet. I am currently sitting in a 450-square-foot dormitory room in Palo Alto, California, a space that is smaller than my mother's walk-in closet, but feels infinitely more expansive because every inch of it belongs to me. The room smells of salt air from the Pacific, strong black coffee, and the faint ozone-like scent of a high-powered server rack humming in the corner. For the first time in 18 years, the air I breathe is clean, devoid of the cloying joy by Dior perfume and the suffocating pressure of unearned expectations. My desk is a simple slab of wood, not a mahogany relic, and it holds a cutting-edge workstation that was provided to me as part of my research grant. I spent this morning in a seminar with a Nobel laureate who didn't care about my zip code or my father's job title. He only cared about the elegance of my code and the potential of my neural networks to save lives. The transition from a waitress in a greasy spoon diner to a Stanford scholar with a multi-million-dollar patent was not a stroke of luck. It was a calculated, grueling ascent fueled by the very friction my parents tried to use to slow me down. I remember the specific texture of my first morning in Palo Alto, the way the golden California sun hit the terracotta tiles of the campus buildings, and the realization that I no longer had to walk 2.4 miles in the humidity to earn my right to exist. I have a bike now, a simple black commuter that I use to navigate the eucalyptus-lined paths of the university, and every time the wind hits my face, I am reminded that I am the one steering my own life. My bank account, which once held crumpled $5 bills from the diner, now holds a seed investment that would make my father's brokerage account look like a rounding error. Yet I still find myself checking the prices of my groceries out of a habit born from survival. I heard through Simone, who eventually left Tyler and moved to a research position in San Diego, that the Westport house feels like a mausoleum now. My mother has retreated into her wellness retreats, though the peace she seeks continues to elude her because she can no longer hide from the fact that she traded her daughter's love for a Bulgari watch. My father is still trying to salvage his reputation at the firm, but the story of the Thanksgiving execution has become a permanent fixture of Connecticut lore, a cautionary tale about the man who was too arrogant to see the genius in his own home. Tyler is reportedly living in a small apartment in Hartford, working a job he hates and complaining to anyone who will listen that his sister stole his future, never realizing that he never actually had a future to begin with. He only had a temporary lease on mine. Sitting here in my dorm, looking out at the palm trees and the distant silhouette of the Stanford dish, I finally understand the ultimate moral of my story. Family isn't blood. Family is not the group of people who share your genetic markers while treating your dreams like trash to be incinerated. Family is the person who sees your worth when you are scrubbing grout on your hands and knees. And family is the person who holds the door open for you not because you are a Miller, but because you are a human being with something to offer the world. I spent 18 years trying to earn a seat at a table that was designed to exclude me, and in the end, I simply built my own table in a city where the only thing that matters is the clarity of your vision and the strength of your character. I am Khloe Miller. I am 19 years old, and for the first time in my life, I am not a disappointment. I am not a servant, and I am not a ghost. I am the author of a future that is as bright as the California sun and as permanent as the code I write. The 90-day countdown is over. The invoice has been sent, and as I close my laptop to head to my afternoon lab session, I realize that the greatest revenge isn't the demolition of their lives. It's the fact that I have finally started living mine. The air in Palo Alto is thin, crisp, and full of possibility. And as I walk out the door of my 450-square-foot kingdom, I don't look back at the gray ash of Westport. I look forward at the horizon, where the truth is finally the only thing that remains.